Ken asked me to say a few words about pulse crop diseases, to talk a little bit about what diseases threaten the three pulses that we have in this demonstration. So behind me are lentils, and we have field peas, and further down we have some chickpeas. So we'll sort of go from block to block, and I'll talk about the potential problems that we'll see. Lentils are probably our most trouble-free pulse crop when it comes to diseases. Unlike on the eastern prairies where you'll see issues like Bacterial Blight, a new disease that's shown up in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, anthracnose, another foliar disease, and Ascochyta blight. Those diseases are a reality there year in, year out. But here in southern Alberta, especially on the eastern side of the province, we're fortunate that we don't see too much of a problem in terms of foliar diseases. It is possible that you could see them in some years, especially years like this where it's wet early in the season. These are soil and seed-borne diseases, and you could inadvertently bring them onto the farm with infected seed. But as I say, year in, year out, we usually haven't seen too much of a problem with those fungal diseases that I mentioned. The two diseases, though, that are economically important in lentils, number one is root rot. Lentils are prone to the same complex of root rot organisms that you'll see in peas and chickpeas. And primary one is Fusarium, which causes the so-called dryland root rot. It attacks the roots and constricts the roots, and so you don't get a good movement of water and nutrients up, and the plants will generally wilt and die. You can even see them attacked at an earlier stage as a seed decay or seedling blight, but if you're using a seed protectant, you can usually get by that stage. The root rot organisms, and I say Fusarium is the major one, but you'll occasionally also see Pythium in wet years or Rhizoctonia, but Fusarium is the main issue. And in particular, there's a species of Fusarium called Fusarium avinaceum, which is our major root rot pathogen in lentils. And it shares that disease with crops like dry beans, chickpeas, and field peas, and even cereals. Wheat is susceptible to Fusarium avinaceum. It's part of the dryland root rot complex. So it's a species that has a broader host range. The Fusarium organism is long-lived in the soil, so this is where we like to see 3 to 4 year rotations with our pulse crops to allow the population of the Fusarium to decrease. The other disease that we've seen in recent years was Sclerotinia, white mold. And in 2010 there were outbreaks of the disease. That year there was really heavy canopies, and we weren't used to seeing it in lentils. It got going underneath the canopies and attacking the stems, and all of a sudden you started to notice the stems sinking down and melting away. And you couldn't see it from above because it tends to attack low on the stems. You actually had to get down there and open up the canopy to see it. And under that heavy canopy, the Sclerotinia spread from plant to plant very quickly. Now we have Lance fungicide registered for it, and I know some guys had seen it in their crop this year and have been spraying for it. So it too benefits from rotation because the sclerotial bodies of the Sclerotinia organism will stay in the soil and attack other broadleaf crops that may follow, things like the pulses, canola, mustard, sunflowers, and so on. Here on the eastern side of the prairie of Alberta, where our disease pressure is usually low. As you get into the irrigated areas or you go a little further north, the disease pressure is usually a little higher because of the moisture and humidity and rainfall. When lentils have an open canopy like you see here, good air circulation, it keeps the foliage dry, and generally it's a shorter time to maturity than a lot of the other pulses, so there's less time for the diseases to affect them. But it is important to scout lentils, and I brought along some publications that are over on the tailgate of the Cypress County truck on scouting for pulse crop diseases and using things like decision support tools where you look at the environment, the stage of growth, and a number of other factors like that in order to decide whether you should spray. But in most years, we'd be probably just using a seed treatment on lentils. That would be the only crop protection products we'd be using. But in years where the disease pressure is higher with Sclerotinia, a foliar spray may be required. Or if you've got some ascochyta or one of the foliar diseases coming in, 1 or 2 sprays may be necessary. But as I said earlier, it's probably one of our more trouble-free pulse crops. Any question on lentils before we move over to field peas? 2 good reference books to have on pulse diseases and other diseases are this book, Diseases of Field Crops in Canada. Has a lot of good pictures and things and deals with all crops, cereals, oilseeds, pulses, special crops. And of course the blue book if you're selecting crop protection products for use as seed treatments or foliar sprays. This is a good reference to have as well. All right, well let's move over to the field peas next. All right, so field peas are a crop where we definitely do have more disease issues. And right from the get-go in the spring, seed decay and seedling blight can be a big issue with peas. Those problems are much worse in processing peas if you're growing some of those because of the high sugar content in the seeds. But even the normal field peas will succumb to seed decay and seedling blight. And again, we have the Pythium, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia complex, those 3 microorganisms, fungi that will attack the plants at the young stage as well as even as they're older and causing root rot. So sometimes there's a continuum between the seed decay right through to the root rot phase with these organisms, so they stay with the crop for the full season. Once you get beyond the seedling stage, if you have some seed-borne ascochyta or mycosphaerella, a couple of fungal diseases, they'll start to show up on the young plants as brown lesions on the lower leaves, and they tend to move from the bottom up. And again, in years when we have more abundant rainfall, higher humidities, or if the crops are being grown under irrigation, the ascochyta mycosphaerella complex can be your #1 problem. And when the infection gets up onto the pods here, it'll penetrate the wall of the pod and get onto the seed, and that means a significant downgrade, whether those peas are going for processing feed or of course for seed. So the mycosphaerella complex, the ascochyta mycosphaerella complex, most people would consider that to be our #1 problem on peas right from the south to the north. Sclerotinia, the same organism I talked about on lentils, does affect peas. And again, when you get heavy stands, especially with these semi-leafless types, they're very dense stands. I've been in a number of pea fields this year where they're up to my chest in height. And down below it's cool, it's moist, and that's where the Sclerotinia organism will work. And it's again a stem rot. Some of the older varieties of peas that laid down on the ground, they were really bad for Sclerotinia. They were just matted right down on the ground, and the organism just bridges from plant to plant at that stage. So the erect archetypes have done a lot to help us with control of Sclerotinia and the foliar diseases that depend on that damp soil surface and humidity in the lower part of the canopy. Once we get on later in the season then, as I mentioned, the Sclerotinia disease can show up in peas. This year we saw a disease called Downy Mildew, which we only see in years when we have cool, wet springs, and it's a systemic fungal disease that causes the leaves to curl up, the plants will stunt and die, and there's sort of a felty gray growth on the underside of the leaves, and that's why we call it Downy Mildew. It's a seed-borne disease, and so you can inadvertently introduce it to your field that way. If it happens to be a warm, dry spring and stays that way for the rest of the season, you may not see any symptoms of foliar infection. But if you do get cool, wet conditions in the spring, it will show up. It grows systemically in the plant, and it will ultimately stunt and kill the plant. Usually when the hot weather comes in July and August, the downy mildew symptoms disappear, and if the plants continue to grow, the upper leaves and will be free of the disease, whereas the the lower leaves may still have some remnants of it. Other diseases that we occasionally see in peas, bacterial blight, we saw a bit of that this year. It's again a seed-borne bacterial disease, splash dispersed with rain. And if you're growing seed for export, there's a zero tolerance in a lot of countries for bacterial blight. Your crops will be inspected and rejected if they have bacterial blight. We're fortunate we don't have many virus issues in peas. In some areas they certainly do, where they have insect vectors like aphids and leafhoppers that are problematic. So in peas, again, if you're lucky with a good growing season, the crop can remain relatively trouble-free. You may only have to spray for the ascochyta and of course treat your seed, and you'll be able to get away with having a reasonably good crop. Any questions on field peas? We've certainly
different varieties here, or why are you standing as a foot lower?
Okay, what we're standing in here, this is a variety trial. Yes, there's different varieties here. I don't know if Ken is he here? Or do you want to comment on it?
Our variety trial, and then this is a herbicide trial.
Right.
To the right.
Okay. Do you want to say just a bit about what you got going on here?
I'm not entirely too sure. It's a contract, just testing out different varieties and different herbicide samples. So I can't really expand on it much more than that. So not really my area. I don't want to say something that's not right. But
okay, so that's what we got: variety trial and herbicide trial. Ken can give you more details. Let's move down and we'll finish up with the chickpeas. I know it's getting close to noon here. Okay, chickpeas are probably one of the newer pulse crops that's been introduced to the prairies, but we've been producing them for 20 years or more. The acreage is greatest in Saskatchewan, and in Alberta and Manitoba it's a smaller acreage crop. It's well suited to dryland production, fairly drought tolerant. There's two main types of chickpeas, the so-called Kabuli chickpeas that are the large seeded types that you see used in the salad bars, the so-called garbanzo beans. And then there's a smaller desi type that is ground and used for flour. When chickpeas were first introduced in Western Canada for commercial production, the first disease that was of significant impact was ascochyta, another foliar disease, a different species that attacks the field peas and the lentils, but a very destructive disease. And all of the varieties that were introduced at the time were highly susceptible. And the growers had crop failures in provinces like Saskatchewan, and that ultimately caused the acreage to decline substantially because there were no fungicides at that time that were registered, or very few. There was very little resistance in either the Kabulis or the desi types. And it wasn't until the breeders began to make some headway in developing and introducing resistance, and we got some foliar fungicides registered for this crop, that it started to take hold again, and now the acreage is rebounding. So the main diseases that we see on this crop, again from the early stage of the crop, you can see seed decay and seedling blight, particularly in untreated seed. And if it's been grown in a field that had recent crops of pulses, especially chickpeas themselves, and again those seed-borne or seedling blight and seed decay can carry through. There's some plants here, and I'll pass them around. This is what the root rot phase looks like in chickpeas, and you'll see on these two here the dark brown color on the roots, and that ultimately stunts and kills the plants, as you see here in these two. So just pass those around, you can have a look. And again, the same complex of Fusarium rhizoctonia and Pythium, with Fusarium being the most important, affects this crop in the same way it does field peas and lentils. So these crops share in common the Fusarium complex, and these fungi are ideally suited to dryland and irrigated soils. Every agricultural field in Alberta has one or more Fusarium species, and many of them are economically important pathogens, causing seed decay, seedling blight, root rot, and in the case of wheat, even head blight and kernel damage. The chickpeas have to be scouted because of their sensitivity to ascochyta blight. And again, I have a scouting guide, a publication that you can pick up from the coffee area there if you're interested. There's a decision support guide where you again integrate crop stage, environmental conditions, susceptibility of the given varieties, and it helps you decide whether or not to spray. Chickpeas are one crop where there has been a lot of fungicide use on this crop. Because the Ascochyta is so explosive, the chickpea canopy always has high humidity. If you plunge your hand into the canopy, you can just feel the moisture down there. Your leaves come out with a bit of dampness, and that was the ideal conditions for the Ascochyta to develop. And it will attack right from the seedling stage, where it's can be a seed-borne issue, right through to the mature plant. As long as there's green tissue there, it's potentially prone to Ascochyta. Moves from the bottom of the plant to the top. It's splash dispersed by water and wind dispersed spores as well. And it can move very quickly in a crop, and this is one crop where I can honestly say I've seen fields virtually destroyed by that disease. Some producers, believe it or not, will spray their chickpeas up to 6 or 8 times with fungicides on a 10-day to 2-week from when the plants are this big up to maturity to protect them against Ascochyta. In most years, probably 2 or 3 sprays might get you by. In other years, you have to use more. Because of the indeterminate growth habit, you're always having green tissue coming along, and this disease will attack the foliage and the pods. Once again, it'll blemish the seed, which ruins it for use, the salad bars and so on. They don't want blemished chickpeas in that case. The root rot complex, again, the same as we saw in the peas and lentils, as I mentioned. Sclerotinia is occasionally a problem in chickpeas, not so much as we see in lentils or in perhaps field peas. Again, being a dryland crop, that takes away some of the favorable environment that the Sclerotinia organism needs. But if you were to grow this crop on a field that had canola last year with high levels of Sclerotinia, you probably would see the disease affecting the crop. In some of our research plots at Brooks, we have lost plots due to Sclerotinia in chickpeas, especially if they're about 1.5 feet tall and really heavy. The fungus just works underneath and kills the stem, and then the crop lodges. There's a related disease called gray mold that also likes lentils in it too. It can be a very vicious sort of stem rot. So there are fungicides that you can use on chickpeas for the foliar diseases. But once again, using disease-free seed or seed that has low levels of seed-borne diseases like Ascochyta. This is actually one where you really want to try and find seed that has 0 Ascochyta. I think up to 0.3%, you may be able to get by, but you definitely got to use a seed treatment. It's such an explosive disease. Try and use disease-free seed. Crop rotations, again, the fungicide packages that I mentioned all need to be considered if you're growing this crop. It does have the serious disease issues, especially with the Ascochyta. In this field here, again, I think there's variety trials. Yes, this is a variety trial. So you're seeing the differences in maturity here. Certainly the varieties that mature earlier will have a shorter infection period and would be less problematic in terms of Sclerotinia and probably Ascochyta as well. And as I mentioned, the breeders are making some progress in developing resistant varieties. And it is a good drought-tolerant pulse crop. It has a very deep root system and is a good option in the dryland areas as a rotational crop. And it seems to be making a resurgence now with some of the prices being reasonably decent. Any questions on chickpea diseases? The one other pulse crop I'll maybe mention is dry edible beans, and they are grown in the irrigated areas more to the west of here. They too have disease issues. many similar ones to the crops that you see here, like white mold, which is or Sclerotinia, which is the #1 problem on that crop. They also have a number of bacterial leaf diseases, which we're fortunate don't plague the lentils, peas, and chickpeas, but dry beans do have bacterial blight issues, and growers will routinely treat the seed with streptomycin as well as use 1 or 2 copper sprays. And the dense canopy of beans presents some unique problems in terms of delivering fungicide deep into the canopy where it needs to be. And as Brian mentioned this morning, we're doing a project looking at fungicide application in solid seeded beans, which is a new trend that we're seeing here in Alberta, going away from the row crop beans planted on 22-inch rows to solid seeded stands, narrower rows. And growers like the solid seeded stands. They're easier to harvest, but they present some disease issues which we're working on with the project we're doing with Brian. So that's a quick overview of pulse diseases, and I think we're just bang on noon. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask now or catch up to me afterwards. And as I mentioned, I brought some publications along on disease scouting and decision support systems for pulses. Feel free to grab some off the tailgate of the Cypress County truck there if you're interested. Any questions? Any other disease questions on any crops that you might have? No? All right.
Okay, you guys join me in thanking Ron.
Thank you.
Okay, lunch should be ready to go. So go on up.